Welcome back to the Daily Lift. In our lives, we often live very fast-paced and hectic ones. And oftentimes we can get to looking around us and we may think we should be farther along than we are, or we see everybody else and we would wish we had what they had. And even as Christians, we can get to complaining. Why? Why do we automatically turn to looking at the negative side of things? Well, the Bible has a lot to say about complaining, and it gives us lots of examples. In Philippians 2:14, Paul tells us, do all things without complaining and disputing. And the Old Testament, we have the example of the children of Israel in the wilderness. And we see in Romans that everything that has been written in the Old Testament is for our learning. And Paul says, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. And so when we look at the Old Testament for these examples, both good and bad, we can learn so much. And if we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the children of Israel, we better study up on them. And so, as we know, the children of Israel were enslaved for over 400 years. After Joseph rescued his family and brought them to Egypt, we see them thriving there. They came with a handful, and then they had thousands. And the Egyptians, they were afraid because there was a Pharaoh that was raised up that did not know Joseph nor fear God. And so he didn't respect them, and he thought, well, let's enslave them so we can keep them under control. So 400 plus years later, we have them crying out to God, asking for deliverance, asking for rescue from this oppression of slavery. And God sends them Moses. And as soon as they get out of Egypt, as soon as they get out, they're heading out into the desert, and they're being pursued by the Egyptians, as Pharaoh did change his mind after that 10th plague. But instead of calling on God and asking for his help, after seeing all of these miracles and these plagues, they start complaining. Why did you send me out here? Why did you send us out here? Are there not enough graves in Israel or in Egypt? And they're complaining about this. You have sent us out here to die now. And then after they get saved from the Egyptians and they walk across the Red Sea on dry land, and they have all of these wonderful miracles and signs. They are being led by a pillar of cloud in the daytime and a pillar of fire at night so they can continue to walk. And throughout all of this, what are you just bringing us out here to starve? Remember all the food and the wonderful things we had in Egypt while they were just being so poorly oppressed. Why? Why do we turn to the negative? Comparison? Maybe it's the scarcity mentality, victimization, discontentment, envy, jealousy, all of these kind of things. There's so many things. Covetousness. We are not lacking reasons for these grumblings and complainings, but ultimately these reasons are just symptoms of a much bigger problem, and that is a lack of faith. We see that these Israelites, they did not believe God. They did not believe Moses, even in the midst of all of the things that they saw. I try to look at that and say, well, if I was there, I would have been of the few that were not complaining and grumbling and that were being helpful to Moses. But sometimes it's easier said from this side looking on. But since Israel responded like this, God turned a 40-day trek into a 40-year trudge. They could have went from Egypt to the promised land in 40 days with all of their stuff, all of their belongings that they had. They could have made it there, crossed over, and inherited that rest that God was promising them. Instead, they were slated to die in the wilderness, and only those of their children would be able to inherit that promised land. And when we have faith, it doesn't make our journey easier, but it makes it a whole lot better. Complaining about things, it has never helped anything in a positive way. So I want to encourage you to be a part of the solution and not the problem. because when you start complaining about things, it starts a chain reaction, and it starts leading us down a certain path that God hates, and a certain path that God has warned us about. In Hebrews chapter 3, the Hebrew writer tells us, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me. They tried me and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with them, with that generation, that they always go astray in their hearts, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Here, the Hebrew writer is reminding us that God does not like complaining. He calls it rebellion. And also, we see what happened to these complainers, that there was no rest for them. They had a spirit of grumbling, a spirit of complaining, and they could find no rest. So I want to encourage you to use the antidote of complaining, grumbling, and that is gratitude. And build up your faith to hedge against those times when things get tough and we can't see the good in it. We can trust in God, and we know that he'll bring us through no matter what. And as always, go lift somebody up.